Hi, thanks for joining in today. I want to talk a little bit more about the Fourth Amendment. We're talking about reasonable suspicion, and we're probably only going to have a couple more videos, including this one, to talk about reasonable suspicion before we move on to something else. So I wanted to give a couple examples in court cases where the Supreme Court or other courts have said, okay, there's reasonable suspicion here, or there's not reasonable suspicion here. Because I think it's good to look at real life examples in order to understand the law in a more realistic and as applied kind of way. So first thing I want to do is kind of give a hypothetical. If somebody is driving down the road and there's a police officer driving behind them, and that person is swerving in and out of their lanes, the officers are going to see that. And the person might not be speeding. Maybe the only thing that's wrong with their driving is that they're swerving in and out of their lanes. And so the officer is going to pull them over. And the officer has reasonable suspicion in order to pull them over and make that detention. And they're likely to do a DUI investigation as a result of that. So that would be an example of where an officer does have reasonable suspicion. And of course, when the officer is looking at whether or not they have reasonable suspicion, they're looking at the totality of the circumstances. They're supposed to be looking at a number of factors, right? So in that situation, if somebody is swerving in and out of their lane, maybe it's late at night when people might be coming home from the bars, maybe it's a Friday night or Saturday night. So those types of things would go into the determination as to whether or not there's a reasonable suspicion to make a traffic stop in that situation. Here's another example of a situation where the Supreme Court has ruled that there was reasonable suspicion for a detention. So say a police officer is driving through a high crime area, right? Whatever that means. An area where there's a lot of drug deals and people walking around with guns, some kind of high crime area. That alone, whether or not something's a high crime area, is a huge topic, hugely debated in the legal field, particularly among defense attorneys versus prosecutors and police officers. So, but for sake of this hypothetical, let's say that a police officer is driving through one of these high crime areas and somebody turns, looks at them, and then runs away. So the Supreme Court looked at a situation just like this, where the police officers chased after the person and then ended up stopping them, doing a Terry pat-down, and finding a gun. And in that situation, the Supreme Court said there was reasonable suspicion. Now, the law does evolve over time. That decision was in 2000. And just this past year, the Ninth Circuit has ruled that running from police alone is not enough to give rise to a reasonable suspicion. And what the Ninth Circuit was looking at was changes in social norms and judgments and what people are recognizing more now, where maybe if somebody from a minority background where they live in a poorer neighborhood or something like that, where most interactions with police are not pleasant and sometimes result in abusive force from the police officers or even death. And in that situation, somebody might run from the police just to avoid being in harm's way. They don't want to get caught in the crossfire. They don't want to get hurt themselves. So the Ninth Circuit has looked at the situation where people would just run from the cops, and that alone is not enough to give rise to a reasonable suspicion to detain somebody. And again, that's from the Ninth Circuit. The Supreme Court hasn't made a decision as far as that case goes, so we'll see how this law develops, but it's a good example of how over time and as society changes, the courts have to play catch up and make changes themselves in order to enforce new, updated, more modern rules. Another example where a California court was looking at whether or not there was reasonable suspicion was a case where there had been a crime in an area where there's a lot of foot traffic, lots of people go through, and there was a description of the suspect for the crime, and it was a 6 foot tall black man, and there might have been like one or two other details to the description, but it was fairly vague in that respect. A week later, after the incident, a police officer who was in that area stopped a 6 foot tall black man, and arrested him, charged him with he was charged with a crime, and the court in that case was looking at whether or not there was reasonable suspicion, and decided no, there's not reasonable suspicion there. Number one, the description that they got of the suspect was extremely vague, and number two, we're talking about a very, very high foot traffic area, so you're going to have a lot of people walking through this place. And number three, it's been a week. I mean, maybe there would have been more of a reasonable suspicion the same day or within that same hour, but we're talking about a week later, and with such a vague description, I mean, there was no reasonable suspicion in that case. And I think that is also another good lesson that we can take from all these cases that we talk about. We wouldn't be talking about these cases unless somebody was charged with a crime, right? So, when we hear something that sounds so absurd, and of course that would be overturned by the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court or whatever court we're talking about, of course they wouldn't have gotten that far. But for us to be talking about these cases means that somebody was charged and something in their case had to be appealed. And that's why it's so important for us to cover these basic topics like reasonable suspicion now, so that we know our own rights, we know the standard that the police officers have to bear in order to detain or arrest or so on and so forth. It's for us to protect ourselves as well. But I want to make sure that if you have questions or if you're in a situation where some of the things that I've been talking about in this video may have come up for you, consult a lawyer, get a lawyer, and let the lawyer fight for you. So thank you for joining me. I hope you learned something. Again, we're doing baby steps here. We'll probably do one more video on reasonable suspicion before we move on, but there's so much more for us to cover. So I hope to see you next time. Thank you.